Graham stared out of the living room window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the suburban rooftops. The house felt empty and cold, devoid of the warmth it once held. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. It had been a year since Neo left, but the sadness in his heart hadn't gone away. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the silence, each second a reminder of how long they'd been apart. Graham's eyes drifted to the photo of him and Na on their wedding day. They looked happy and in love. What had gone wrong? He remembered the night she left as if it were yesterday. It all started over something small, like whose turn it was to do the dishes. Before you knew it, it had turned into a big argument. Graham said, "You never listen to me," and Na said, "It's always about what you want, what you need." Graham felt his temper rising. Her intensity was palpable. "That's not fair. I've always put us first. You're the one who's been distant lately." Nina's eyes flashed dangerously. "Maybe I'm distant because I feel like I'm living with a stranger. You don't even try to understand me anymore." "Understand you? How can I when you barely?" "Talk to me," Graham said, his voice rising with frustration. "Every time I try to have a real conversation, you shut down or change the subject. I can't believe you're saying that. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not listening. You're just waiting for your..." They kept going back and forth, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. Finally, Na had stormed upstairs, emerging minutes later with a hastily packed suitcase. "I can't do this anymore, Gr. I need some time a Washington-y." While Graham had started to panic, his heart racing. She was already at the door, her hand on the knob. "I'm going to my mother's. Don't call me. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Graham standing in the doorway, watching her car disappear down the street. A year later, Graham was still waiting. He respected her wishes and hadn't called or tried to contact her, but the silence was getting to him. He was pulled from his thoughts by a sharp knock at the door. Frowning, Graham checked his watch. It was nearly 9. Morning. It was far too late for casual visitors. As he approached the door, he heard a faint sound that made him pause. Was that a baby crying? Graham's heart rate quickened as he opened the door. There, standing on his porch, was Na. Her hair was disheveled, and dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. In her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, was a squirming, crying infant. Graham's voice was barely above a whisper. Shock was evident in every syllable. "What's going on, Nina?" He met her gaze, a mixture of determination and something else, a hint of guilt. "This is your son," she said, her voice hoarse. "Take care of him." Before Graham could process what was happening, Na thrust the baby into his arms. He instinctively cradled the child, his mind reeling. "Wait," he began, but his words fell on empty air. Na was already hurrying down the steps, practically running to her car. "Graham," he called after her, careful not to jostle the baby. "Stop," he added, his voice firm. "We need to talk about this." But she didn't even look back. In a matter of seconds, she was in her car, the engine roaring to life. Graham could only watch dumbfounded as she sped away, leaving him standing in the doorway with a crying infant in his arms. The baby's cries grew louder, snapping Graham back to reality. He looked down at the tiny face, scrunched up and red-eyed, and saw that it was his son. How was that possible? They hadn't been together in over a year. Graham's mind was racing as he stepped. He went back into the house and closed the door behind him. He gently bounced the baby to try to calm him down and reassure him that everything was going to be okay. Despite his own emotions, he kept repeating, "It's okay, little guy. We'll figure this out." The next few hours passed in a blur. Graham managed to calm the baby and get some formula and diapers from a late-night trip to the nearby convenience store. The infant finally drifted off to sleep in a makeshift bed of blankets. Graham collapsed onto the floor in exhaustion. Graham was sitting on the couch, head in hands. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't believe it. His son? But the math didn't add up. Had she been unfaithful? Was that why she left? Had she been pregnant this whole time? Graham's hands clenched into fists. He was angry and hurt. How could she do this? How could she just dump a child on his doorstep and vanish again as the first light? As dawn broke, Graham made a decision. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. Later that morning, after another nerve-wracking trip for baby supplies, Graham sat in a sterile waiting room. The baby was asleep in a carrier beside him. He had to know the truth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of diaper changes, sleepless nights, and anxious waiting. Graham took emergency leave. From work, Graham was too preoccupied to focus on anything but the situation at hand. Finally, a week after Nina's unexpected visit, Graham received the call he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Mr. Hawkins, the clinical voice on the other end, said, "We have your results." Graham's grip on the phone tightened. "Yes, I'm sorry, sir, but the test shows that you are not the biological father of the child." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Graham sank into a chair. His legs suddenly I couldn't support him. I saw him manage to choke out, "Thank you," before ending the call. His mind was reeling. It wasn't his son. She'd lied, she'd cheated, she'd had another man's child and then tried to pass it off as his responsibility. As the reality of the situation sank in, Graham's shock gave way to burning anger. How dare she? How could she betray him like this, lie to him and manipulate him? He looked over at the baby sleeping peacefully in his carrier, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. This innocent child is caught in the middle of some pretty serious adult issues. Graham's jaw clenched. He wouldn't let this stand. She couldn't just walk back into his life, dump her problems on him, and disappear again. She needed to face the consequences of her actions with renewed determination. Graham picked up his phone again. His fingers hovered over the keypad for just a moment before he dialed. "What's your emergency?" Graham took a deep breath. "I need to report a case of child abandonment and possible fraud," as he began to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Graham felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was done being a victim of Nina's lies and manipulation. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter how painful it might be. The baby stirred in his sleep, and Graham found himself wondering about the child's future. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He would make sure this innocent boy didn't suffer for the Graham continued his statement to the police, setting in motion a chain of events that would change everything. He sat in his living room, the phone still clutched in his hand. The call to the police had been brief, but intense. He replayed the conversation in his mind. "What's your emergency? I need to report a case of child abandonment and possible fraud." He had said, his voice was steady despite the turmoil inside. "You can give me more details, sir." Graham took a deep breath. "My estranged wife showed up at my door a week ago with a baby. She said it was my son and left him with me before disappearing again. I've just gotten the results of a paternity test. The child isn't mine." There was a brief pause on the other end. "This is a serious matter. An officer will be dispatched to your location to take a full statement. Can you provide your address?" Graham hung up. The baby still didn't even know the child's names. He slept peacefully in his carrier, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Within the hour, there was a sharp knock at the door. It was the police. Graham opened it to find two officers standing on his porch. The older of the two was Mr. Hawkins. He had a mask of professional neutrality on. Graham nodded and said, "That's me. Please come in." The younger officer was Officer Martinez. He noticed the sleeping infant. "Is this the child in question?" "Yes," Graham replied, his voice showing a mix of emotions. "My wife left him here and took off," he added. The older officer, Detective Johnson, pulled out a notepad and said, "Let's start from the beginning. Mr. Hawkins, tell us everything for the next hour," he instructed. Graham recounted the events of the past year, the arguments, Nina's departure, her sudden return with the baby, and the subsequent paternity test. The officers listened intently, occasionally interjecting. "With questions and you're certain the child isn't yours?" Detective Johnson asked. His pen poised over the notepad. Graham's jaw clenched. "Absolutely," he said. "The DNA test was conclusive." Officer Martinez leaned forward. "Mr. Hawkins, do you have any idea where your wife might be now?" Graham shook his head. "No, she didn't leave any contact information. She just vanished." Detective Johnson nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll need to track her down. This is a serious case of child abandonment and potentially, if she knew she was passing off someone else's kid as yours." "What happens now?" Graham asked, glancing at the still sleeping baby. "We'll open an investigation," Officer Martinez said. "We'll try to find your wife and get her side of the story. In the meantime, we'll need to involve Child Protective Services." Graham was worried about the baby. He hadn't done anything wrong and was innocent in all this. Detective Johnson's expression softened a little. "We understand. CPS will make sure the baby is looked after while we sort this out. Do you have any other information that might help us locate your wife?" It might help us find your wife, or friends or family members she might have contacted. Graham thought for a moment. She said she was going to stay with her mother when she left a year ago. Martha Reeves. She lives in Springdale, about an hour from here. The officers exchanged glances. That's a good lead, Detective. Johnson said, We'll look into it, Mr. Hawkins. Thanks for your help with this. We'll be in touch as the investigation goes on. As the officers were leaving, the baby started to cry. Graham moved to comfort him, but then he hesitated. Officer Martinez noticed his uncertainty. Mr. Hawkins, she said gently, you did the right thing by reporting this. We'll make sure the child is taken care of. Graham nodded, a lump forming in his throat despite everything. He'd grown attached to the little guy over the past week. Thank you, he managed after the officers left, promising to send a CPS worker. Graham soon sank onto the couch. The house felt emptier than ever. The weight of recent events pressed down on him. He closed his eyes, remembering happier times with Nina. How had it come to this? The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and visits from CPS. The baby was placed in temporary foster care. Graham was torn between relief and guilt. He threw himself into cooperating with the investigation, providing any information he could to help track down Na. A week after his initial report, Graham received a call from Detective Johnson. Mr. Hawkins, we've made some progress. The case is going well, Graham. Could you come down to the station? Of course, I'll be right there. Graham was led to an interview room where Detective Johnson and Officer Martinez were waiting. Thank you for coming in, Detective Johnson. We've managed to locate your wife. He felt a rush of anger and anticipation. Where was she? She was staying with her mother, as he had suggested. Officer Martinez explained that they had brought her in for questioning the day before. Graham was impressed. His hands clenched into fists under the table. Detective Johnson's expression was grim. Mr. Hawkins, I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially thought. Your wife has made some allegations of her own. Graham felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of allegations has she made? That you were aware of her pregnancy. Officer Martinez said carefully that you had agreed to raise the child as your own. Regardless of paternity, Graham was shocked. He stood up and said, That's a lie. I didn't know until she showed up at my door. Please calm down, Detective Johnson said, motioning for Graham to sit down. We're not taking her claims at face value. We're investigating all angles. Graham sank back into his seat, his mind reeling. Graham couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife had abandoned their child, tried to pin it on him, and was now lying to cover her tracks. Officer Martinez leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Hawkins, we understand this is difficult, but we need you to walk us through your relationship with your wife again. Any conversations? They asked about children, your future together, anything that might shed light on the situation. For the next 2 hours, Graham talked about his marriage with Na in excruciating detail. Every argument, every tender moment, every discussion about their future. The officers wanted to know everything. I never agreed to raise another man's child. Graham said firmly, I never agreed to raise. He was talking to Na and I. We had our problems, but I never thought she'd do something like this. As the interview wound down, Detective Johnson looked at Graham steadily. Mr. Hawkins, I want you to understand the seriousness of this situation if your wife's claims are proven false. If she's found to have lied, she'll be facing some serious charges. But if there's any truth to what she said, there isn't. Graham spoke up, leaving no room for doubt. The detective continued, saying that they needed to be thorough. They'd be looking into both of your backgrounds, financial records, phone records, and anything else that might corroborate or disprove these claims. Graham nodded, showing he was tired. He said he understood and that he had nothing to hide. He left the station, feeling a mix of emotions. He was angry at Na for her betrayal and lies. He was frustrated at being caught in this nightmare. But underneath it all, he felt a deep sadness for the life he'd lost. They'd once been close, but now they were completely broken up. Over the next few weeks, Graham's life became a whirlwind of police interviews, meetings with lawyers, and invasive questions about his personal life. Every aspect of his relationship with Nena was put under a microscope by strangers trying to uncover the truth. Graham remained firm in his account of events and cooperated fully with the investigation, turning over phone records, emails, and financial documents. He hoped each piece of evidence would bring him closer to vindication, and Nenina closer to facing the consequences of her actions. After another long day of interviews at the police station, Graham found himself sitting in his car in the parking lot, unable to muster the energy to drive home. He pulled out his phone and stared at Nina's number. Despite everything, he still had a part of him that wanted answers directly from her. His thumb hovered over the call button. Just then, Graham's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Detective Johnson and Mr. Hawkins. The detective's voice came through sounding tired but determined. "We've made a breakthrough in the case. Can you come back inside?" Graham's heart raced. "Of course I'll be right there," back in the familiar interview room. In the room, Graham found Detective Johnson and Officer Martinez waiting, along with a woman he didn't recognize. Mr. Hawkins said, "This is District Attorney Sarah Padamand. Detective Johnson introduced her as the person who's been looking over the evidence in your case." The DA nodded at Graham, her expression serious. Mr. Hawkins said, "After a thorough investigation, we've found some pretty significant information." Graham leaned forward, his mouth dry. "What kind of information is that?" The DA opened a file in front of her. "We found evidence that your wife, Na Hawkins, has a history of similar behavior. There are records of her attempting to deceive other men about paternity in the past." The room seemed to spin around Graham. "There were others," Detective Johnson said. "We've identified at least 2 other instances where Miss Hawkins tried to pass off a child as belonging to a man she was involved with. Paternity tests proved otherwise," Officer Martinez added. "We've found financial records showing large withdrawals and suspicious transactions around the time she left you a year ago. It seems like she may have been planning this for some time." Graham felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I had no idea. I thought Patel's voice was sympathetic. But, Mr. Hawkins, based on the evidence we've gathered, we're prepared to move forward with charges against your wife. These include child abandonment fraud and potentially other charges as we delve deeper into her financial activities." "What happens now?" Graham asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be issuing a warrant." Detective Johnson explained that, given the nature of the charges and her history of deception, we believe she may be a flight risk. We need to act quickly, as the reality of the situation sank in. Graham felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. He had loved the woman and their life together. Mr. Hawkins said, "It's all been built on lies." He drew Graham's attention back to the present. "I want you to understand that you're as much a victim in this as anyone." Graham nodded, unable to form words. The betrayal, the lies, the weight of everything. As he left the station that night, Graham felt the weight of shattered trust bearing down on him. He knew that his life would never be the same again. The coming days would bring more challenges: Nina's arrest, a likely trial, and the media attention that would surely follow. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was going to come out tonight, and with it, the chance for justice. Walking to his car under the glow of streetlights, Graham made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, not just for himself, but for all those who had been deceived. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally start to rebuild his life from the ashes of betrayal. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the street as Detective Johnson's car pulled up to Graham's house. Graham, who had been anxiously pacing in his living room since dawn, rushed to the door before the detective could even knock. "Did you find her?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Johnson's face was calm and professional. "We did, Mr. Hawkins. Nina's in custody." She was clenched, it seems. Detective Johnson nodded. "We need you to come to the station. There are some matters we need to discuss." "Well, Nena is asking to speak with you." Graham's eyebrows shot up. "She wants to talk to me." "After everything, it's your decision," the detective said, "but it might help provide some closure. And frankly, if she says anything incriminating, it could strengthen our case." Graham thought for a moment, then nodded. "Let's go." The ride to the police station was tense, filled with dread and swirling thoughts. What could she possibly have to say to him? What more lies would she try to spin at the station? Graham was led to an interview room through the one-way glass. He could see Na sitting at the table, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked tired, her usually immaculate appearance a little disheveled. Detective Johnson turned to Graham. "Remember, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. If you do, we'll be right outside." Graham squared his shoulders. "I'm ready." Graham entered the room and Knox's head snapped up for a moment. Their eyes met and Graham saw a flash of emotion, but it was gone before he could be sure. "I'm glad you came," Graham said, his voice calm and neutral. "What do you want?" Knox asked, looking down at her hands. Back up at him. "I wanted to explain, to apologize." Graham's voice was sharp. "For which part? For cheating, for abandoning your child, for trying to pin it all on me?" Nina flinched at his words. "I know I've done terrible things. I just panicked. I didn't know what to do." Graham leaned forward. His eyes were hard. "You didn't know what to do? How about telling the truth? Nah, how about taking responsibility for once in your life?" "I was scared." Nina's voice rose with a note of desperation. "I thought if I just left the baby with you, everything would work out somehow. I didn't think." "You didn't think." Graham cut her off. You didn't think about anyone but yourself, did you, Nina?" Nina's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Graham's laugh was bitter. "Don't play dumb. The police told me about the others. How many men have you tried a trick like this on?" Nina's face crumpled. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to." What did Graham want? Money, an easy life, to avoid responsibility. Tears were streaming down Nina's face. "I don't know why I did it. I just felt trapped and scared. I made one bad decision after another." Graham sat back, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. "Now look where it's got me. It got you arrested and facing serious charges. Was it worth it?" No, she shook her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "No, God, no. I've ruined everything. My life, your life, that poor baby's life." "That's right," Graham said, his voice cold. "That child, your son, is the real victim here. Did you even think about him when you left him on my doorstep?" I looked up and saw her eyes were red-rimmed. "I thought he'd be better off with you. You've always been the strong one, the responsible one. I knew you'd take care of him." Ram's fists clenched under the table. "That wasn't your decision to make. You had no right to dump your responsibilities on me and lie to me." I know. I'm sorry, Graham. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am so sorry." There was a long moment of silence in the room. Graham studied the woman across from him. She was the woman he had once loved, but now she was a stranger, consumed by her own lies and mistakes. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and controlled. "You're right. It doesn't change anything. Your apologies and tears don't undo what you've done to me, to that child, and to who knows how many others. You'll have to live with the consequences of your actions." As he turned to leave, Graham was stopped by a voice. "What's going to happen to the baby?" Graham paused at the door. "Not looking back, he'll be taken care of by people who actually care about his welfare. Goodbye." With that, he walked out, leaving his past and Na behind him outside the interview room. Detective Johnson was waiting. "How did it go?" Graham took a deep breath. "About as well as could be expected. What happens now?" The detective's expression was sympathetic but professional. "Now we move forward with the charges. Child abandonment, fraud, attempted deception, paternity. It's a serious charge, Mr. Hawkins. Given the evidence we've gathered in her attempt to flee, I'd say she's looking at significant jail time." Graham nodded, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. "Good. She needs to face the consequences of her actions. There's something else," Detective Johnson added, "given the circumstances. The district attorney wants to look into Nina's financial activities more closely. They're suspicious of broader fraud, possibly involving her workplace." "What do you mean?" "We received information suggesting that she may have been embezzling funds from her employer," the detective explained. "Can you explain some of the large withdrawals we found in her accounts?" "Jesus," Graham muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Is there no end to this?" Detective Johnson placed a hand on Graham's shoulder. "I know this is a lot to process, but I want you to know you've been instrumental in bringing all of this to light. You've potentially," Graham nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Over the next few weeks, the case against Na unfolded rapidly as news of her arrest spread. More details came to light, and her employer, a mid-sized accounting firm, launched an internal investigation and quickly uncovered evidence of long-term financial activities. Financial manipulation. Graham found himself in the middle of a media frenzy. Reporters were camped outside his house, clamoring for statements about his fraudulent wife and the shocking betrayal. He refused to engage, focusing instead on cooperating with the ongoing investigation and trying to piece his life back together. One evening, As Graham sat in his living room, the TV muted to avoid yet another news report about the case. His phone rang. It was Sarah Patel, the district attorney. The attorney, Mr. Hawkins, sounded tired but satisfied. I wanted to update you personally. Nina's employer has pressed charges for embezzlement. With the other charges, she's looking at a minimum of 15 years in prison. Graham let out a long breath. I see. Thank you for letting me know there's more. Sarah continued, explaining that, given the severity of the charges and the mounting evidence, Nina has agreed to a plea deal. She'll plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. For a slightly reduced sentence? Graham asked. His voice was tight. She's looking at 12 years minimum, Sarah explained. There's no possibility of early parole. It's a good deal, Mr. Hawkins. It spares you and the other victims the ordeal of a trial. Graham closed his eyes, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Thank you, Miss Patel, for everything. After hanging up, Graham sat in silence for a long while, processing the news. 12 years felt like justice, but it felt hollow somehow. No amount of jail time could undo the damage he'd caused. The next morning, Graham made a decision. He called his boss and requested an extended leave of absence. He started packing, throwing clothes into a suitcase. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Johnson. Nina's sentencing is tomorrow. Graham stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Thank you, but I won't be there. He finished packing quickly. He threw his suitcase in the car and drove. He didn't have a specific destination in mind, just a need to get away to process everything that had happened as the miles rolled by. As he drove, Graham found his thoughts drifting to the baby Nina's son. He wondered where the child was now and hoped he was being cared for by people who would love him unconditionally. After a few hours of driving, Graham pulled over at a scenic overlook. He got out of the car and leaned against the railing, looking out. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe freely, looking over the valley below. His phone buzzed again with another text from Detective Johnson. It said that the sentencing was complete and that he would serve 12 years as agreed. Graham typed out a simple reply, "Thank you for everything." He put his phone away and felt a sense of finality wash over him. It was over. Nina would face the consequences of her actions, and he was free. He was free from the lies and the manipulation and the constant doubt. With no more doubt, he was free to start over and rebuild his life on his own terms. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Graham got back in his car. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time he felt hopeful about the journey. The road stretched out before him, full of possibilities. Whatever came next, Graham knew one thing for certain. He was stronger now. Stronger for having faced this ordeal, and for having stood his ground and refused. As he drove into Gathering Township, Graham allowed himself a small smile. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. That was all he really needed to know. Miles down the road, Graham pulled into a small diner. He sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee. He overheard a conversation between two locals. "Did you hear about that woman who got sinned today?" one of them was saying. "Yeah, the one who abandoned her baby and tried to pin it on her ex." "Husband, yeah," the other replied, shaking his head. 12 years, sir, you're right. If you ask me," Graham tensed, waiting for the inevitable discussion of his role in the story. But it never came to these strangers. He was just another traveler passing through. As he finished his coffee and prepared to hit the road again, Graham felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world was moving on, and so could he. Back in his car, Graham pulled out a map and traced a route. He traced his finger along the highways, considering his options. Then, on impulse, he closed his eyes and let his finger fall randomly on the map. When he opened his eyes, he saw where his finger had landed. A small town he'd never heard of, hundreds of miles away. Graham smiled. It was a good destination, as good as any. He started the engine and glanced at himself in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him was older and more weathered than he remembered. But there he was. There was a strength in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Time for a new chapter," Graham said to himself, as he pulled out of the car park and onto the open road. The past was behind him, the future uncertain but full of possibility. For now, that was enough. As Graham's car disappeared into the distance, the story of Nina's betrayal and its aftermath faded into the background. It would always be a part of him, a scar on his history. But he wasn't sure what to expect, but Graham was ready to face it. He'd weathered the storm of betrayal and come out stronger. Whatever challenges awaited him, he'd meet them head on, armed with the hard-won wisdom of his experiences. The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of possibility cutting through the landscape. As the miles rolled by, Graham felt the weight of the past growing lighter with each passing moment.